The Legend of Zelda is one of the most iconic series in all of gaming, and also happens to be my personal favorite. I've set out to rank every main series game and compile the Ultimate Zelda series ranking. In this video, we are looking at one of the most highly regarded games of all time, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. We will be scoring the game across these 10 categories. Each category will be scored from 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. Each category score is being chosen in relation to other games in the series. At the end, everything will be averaged out to get our final result. A quick note, the score will be entirely based off the original SNES version, though I don't think there would have been any score differences between it and the GBA version. Spoilers ahead, and also make sure to stick around to the end of the video where I will reveal the next Zelda review. One day, a band of evil thieves managed to open the gateway to the Sacred Realm, where the mystical Triforce was hidden. Upon finding the sacred golden relic, the leader of the thieves, Ganondorf, slew his followers and claimed it as his own. Before long, dark powers began to flow forth from the Sacred Realm. People were drawn into this darkness and never heard from again. As a result, the King of Hyrule ordered the 7 sages to seal the entrance to the Sacred Realm. A great battle ensued. Monsters poured into the Light World from the Sacred Realm and attacked the castle. The Knights of Hyrule defended the sages during the great battle against evil, and, though most of them perished in the struggle, the sages were able to cast their seal, stopping the flow of darkness and trapping the evil King Ganon within. This battle became known as the Imprisoning War. Once the conflicts against Ganon had ceased, Hyrule entered a time of peace which lasted for centuries, until one day, when unexplained catastrophes began to occur. Pestilence and drought ravaged the land. Thinking the recent disasters plaguing Hyrule were somehow linked to the sage's seal, the king investigated it, but found it to be intact. Desperate for answers, he offered rewards for anyone who could find the source of Hyrule's troubles. In response, a stranger named Aghanim appeared as if from nowhere and stayed the catastrophes with mighty magic. As a reward, the king gave him a new position as chief advisor to the throne, and the common folk proclaimed him their hero. Once more, peace appeared to have returned to Hyrule, yet all was not well. Aghanim began to govern Hyrule in place of the king and abuse his political power as he saw fit. Rumors spread that Aghanim planned to kill the king and take the crown for himself, and that strange magical experiments were taking place in the castle tower at night. He cast spells on the soldiers and kidnapped the young maidens descended from the sages, using their powers in an attempt to break the seal placed on the Sacred Realm. The game starts with Link being awakened in the middle of a stormy night by a telepathic plea from Princess Zelda, who tells him that she is being held prisoner in the dungeon of the castle and needs help. Now wide awake, Link finds his uncle with a sword and shield in hand. He tells Link not to leave the house, then sets off for the castle. Link ignores his uncle's warnings and follows him, only to arrive at the castle to find him gravely wounded. He gave Link his sword and shield and entrusted him with the fate of Princess Zelda. Link proceeds to rescue Zelda, and the two escape the castle through its sewer system to the sanctuary just north. There, the priest tells Link that the only weapon powerful enough to defeat Aghanim was the sacred Master Sword. He then sends him to find the elder Sahasrahla, who explains that not just anyone can wield the legendary blade, and that a hero must appear from the descendants of the Knights of Hyrule. To prove himself worthy of wielding the Blade of Evil's Bane, Link would need to acquire the 3 Pendants of Virtue. After successfully obtaining the pendants and withdrawing the magical sword from its pedestal in the Lost Woods, Zelda calls out to Link yet again, this time warning that soldiers have invaded the sanctuary. Link hurries off to the sanctuary only to find that he was a moment too late, and that the soldiers had already taken Zelda off to Hyrule Castle. Once again, Link hurries to rescue her, and once again arrives too late, as Aghanim was already in the process of sending Princess Zelda to the Dark World to finish his ordeal. Upon completing this ritual, little time was needed before the sage's seal was completely broken. Link goes on to defeat Aghanim, who then also draws him into the Dark World, saying he is not truly defeated yet. There, Link is contacted telepathically by Sahasrahla, who tells him that the world he is standing in is actually what was once the Sacred Realm, but it was transformed by Ganon's evil wish to conquer the world to become the Dark World. He then commissions Link with the task of rescuing the 7 imprisoned maidens from the dungeons scattered across the Dark World. Upon freeing them all, Link travels to Ganon's tower, where the 7 maidens use their combined power to dispel the barriers sealing off the entrance. Link proceeds to traverse the tower and then defeat Aghanim a second time, this time killing him for good. Upon his defeat, the spirit of Ganon rises from the body, turns into a bat, and flies off into the Pyramid of Power, where Link and Ganon face off for the final battle. With the power of the silver arrows and the Master Sword, Link finally vanquishes Ganon, recovers the Triforce, and by making a wish, reverts the effects of Ganon's evil reign over Hyrule and ultimately restores the land to its former glory. Story gets a 4 out of 5. A Link to the Past laid much of the groundwork for the lore in the Legend of Zelda series. Pivotal ideas such as the 3 goddesses, the Sacred Realm, the Imprisoning War, and Ganondorf as a character are all owed to this game. Additionally, the story on your playthrough is very compelling and keeps things interesting throughout, with twists and turns along the way. While it may not be as cinematic by today's standards, between the rich lore provided in the manual and the storytelling done in-game, it hardly shows its age. The world of A Link to the Past is incredibly well designed. Hyrule is quite easy to navigate, but also has enough obstacles along the way to keep things fresh. Where things really get interesting is the Dark World. A Link to the Past is really 2 overworlds in one. The Dark World is more complex to navigate with far more dangerous enemies. The play between the 2 overworlds is nothing short of genius. The interaction added to find portals and the use of the magic mirror to switch between the 2 worlds to get to new areas is balanced perfectly. It could have been made far too complex and been a spot of frustration, but it's done in a way that makes the player think and make them feel really smart when they figure it out. The world gets a 5 out of 5. I can't think of a better overworld for a 2D Zelda than A Link to the Past. It's small enough to get where you need to go easily without it feeling too small. It's really fun to dash across both Hyrule and the Dark World, and there's just enough puzzles to keep navigating the lands interesting. The art style of A Link to the Past has aged like a fine wine. The iconic sprite work of this game still looks incredible. Yeah, Link randomly has some pink hair, but even still, everything just works out and looks great. Beyond just the in-game graphics, I also have to include the incredible official artwork that can be seen in the manual of the game. A lot of this imagery was just as important as the in-game art at capturing the imaginations of players and drawing them into the land of Hyrule. 5 out of 5 for the art. A Link to the Past legendary sprite art still looks just as good now as it did in the 90s. It's no surprise that even today some modern games have tried to mimic a similar style. I would describe the gameplay and combat of A Link to the Past as very solid. It's of course not without its flaws, but it mostly controls smoothly. The nice arcing sword slash makes dealing with enemies a breeze. There are moments where you feel the game's age, however. Only having one item selected at a time can be a little annoying when you need to switch between multiple items. but it's not nearly as bad or needed to be done as frequently as the Game Boy or Game Boy Color titles, thankfully. There are moments when the controls can feel a bit stiff and you sometimes don't move exactly as you wanted to. This is certainly exasperated by areas with ice or thin platforms that are easy to fall off of. This doesn't help that enemies can send Link flying around like a pinball. They probably could have chilled out a bit on the recoil. Enemies in general can also feel cheap at times when they are literally hovering on top of you as you continually take damage. Though there are classic Zelda-type puzzles scattered through the game, the combat and slew of enemies will be your greatest challenge during your playthrough. Gameplay gets a 4 out of 5. Though I had a few nitpicks, those moments are not nearly as frequent enough to significantly detract from the experience. A Link to the Past gameplay has, for the most part, standed the test of time. A Link to the Past features a large array of items and honestly maybe one of the most impressive lineups of any Zelda game. One of the coolest parts is there's some optional items like the Magic Cape, Cane of Burna, the Bombos Medallion, and the Fire Shield, which that last one I didn't even know existed until writing this script. You have your classic Zelda staples, the bombs, bow, boomerang, and making its first appearance, the hookshot. Most items work great. The boomerang is particularly useful compared to 3D games, with so many aggressive enemies about. When it comes to the bow, I feel like the aiming needs to be a little too precise. It can be really annoying when you miss a target that really felt like it should have been a hit. The hookshot is fun and a useful item to be able to cross gaps by hooking onto blocks or other objects like skulls, but I feel like it really found its footing in 3D Zelda games. The Pegasus boots are definitely one of the signature items of A Link to the Past. It's so useful to crash into things and to do running attacks, but it's also fun just to dash across the field of Hyrule. The Magic Hammer is probably one of the weaker items in the game. It just doesn't pack the same punch as the others. It feels very normal, like you're just using an old mallet you found in your uncle's shed. Items get a 5 out of 5. A Link to the Past has items galore, and not only that, so many upgrades. It feels incredible to upgrade the Master Sword not once but twice, upgrade your armor twice. Other items like the boomerang or shield can be upgraded as well. Not every item is equally useful, but there's enough variety for you to deal with most enemies in a variety of ways, which gives you the freedom to use many different items. A Link to the Past has a massive collection of dungeons. One of the best parts of the game is that after completing the first 4 dungeons, you have a lot of choice in how you want to tackle the dungeons that follow it. It feels like it gives you the right amount of freedom without feeling directionless as some may have felt playing the original Legend of Zelda. I'll be going through each dungeon in the order I happen to play them in this playthrough. Eastern Palace is the first proper dungeon. I think it hits the right amount of difficulty. It's not a cakewalk, but certainly not too difficult. The most memorable part is definitely this weird hallway where balls are shooting at you. The Desert Palace is a little more open and goes by pretty quickly. It's cool you do get a brief moment of being outdoors before entering the final stretch of the dungeon. Tower of Hera is where we start to see a bit more puzzle elements enter the dungeons. The blue and red switches, which opens up their respective color gates, creates some fun and interesting puzzle scenarios. There's plenty of these hard-hat beetles which I'm not very fond of, and you'll probably spend most of your time on the final boss than the actual dungeon. More on that later. The Dark Palace is actually one of my least favorite dungeons in the game. I'm just not a fan of the dark room parts, and this dungeon has it in spades. I do appreciate how this dungeon uses portals between the 2 worlds, more so than any other dungeon. I feel like that mechanic was a bit underutilized. Gargoyle's Domain is a dungeon I think a lot of people do next so they can get the sword upgrade, which is exactly what I did. I think the dungeon has a lot of unique elements from its large open first area to the rescue mission to conclude the dungeon. The Swamp Palace is a nice fun dungeon, certainly one of the least complex water-based dungeons in the series, and is a fun introduction to the hookshot as an item. Misery Mire is an extremely appropriate name.
I hate it here!
Part of the reason I suffered so much in this dungeon is because I did it earlier than I should have. I recommend coming here once you have the Blue Mail armor upgrade, because things just hit so dang hard in this dungeon. Even 4 fairies stacked in bottles, you're gonna be eating it quite often. I really wanted the cane item in this dungeon to make a puzzle in the Ice Palace easier, but I certainly paid for the privilege to do so. Coming off of Misery Mire's Skull Woods feels pretty easy. The multiple entrances through the forest and spooky interior give this dungeon a unique vibe. This one is definitely one of my personal favorites. The Ice Palace will test your patience. This is one of those times the game controls may fail you and cause a lot of frustration. Even simple things like going down some stairs will be a challenging affair. The reward of the Blue Mail is at least well worth the effort of this dungeon. Just get ready to fall off ledges over and over and over. For the penultimate dungeon, I actually think Turtle Rock is not nearly as frustrating as some of the previous dungeons. The mechanic of riding around on controllable platforms is pretty fun and only becomes annoying in one of the final rooms where it's just a bit of a nightmare. Otherwise, I quite enjoy the dungeon. Ganon's Tower lives up to the status of being a final dungeon. This really is the ultimate challenge. It's quite a long dungeon with the basement section being tough but reasonable, but then the upper floors being an insane gauntlet. The run you have to make it all the way to the end is nothing short of hell. It just keeps going and going. I can't tell you how many times I died even with 4 fairies. It was just a lot of trial and error before I finally had the right amount of luck and memorization on how to deal with each room. Dungeons get a 4 out of 5. A Link to the Past has an impressive dungeon lineup in both volume and design. There's a few dungeons that are just really annoying, which brings the score down. I will not deny though how expertly crafted the dungeons are. They are so brilliant that a novice can spend 30 minutes to an hour plus in each dungeon, while an expert could complete it in an unbelievably short amount of time. A design where those who know the game well are rewarded is something this game had that was sorely missed in the series until recently. The standard enemies in A Link to the Past are mostly good. Memorable ones include the Hyrule Knights, Igors, or Goriah. There are some enemies that are brutally frustrating. These little Dacto guys that are chilling outside of Misery Mire are so unassuming but hit so freaking hard. The red variation of the Goriah is also super annoying to deal with. It takes a moment to wrap your brain around aiming your bow properly and avoiding its projectile whenever it looks at you. The hard hat beetles can also die in a fire for all I care. They always set me flying off of a cliff. Now moving on to the bosses. The Armos Knights are pretty straightforward. Just spam your arrows and you win. Not exactly exciting, but perfectly acceptable for a first boss. The 3 Land Molas are certainly a step up in difficulty. It can be tough to position yourself correct to do damage, and it's a challenge to be able to avoid all these projectiles as each one comes out of the ground. Moldorm is infamous for a reason. The only weak spot is its tail, and it moves around very erratically. Its speed picks up as it takes more damage. Every slash to it sends you bouncing back, and if you fall off, you get to start all over again. This is what I meant when I'd say you'll spend half of the Tower of Hera just trying to take down this boss. Aghanim was the first creation of the Zelda tennis boss, to my knowledge. Maybe I'm just bad, but I can never figure out when the lightning attack is coming. A fun fight nonetheless. You do fight Aghanim again at the end of Ganon's Tower, where there are multiple copies of him, amping up the difficulty. Helmasaur King feels very much like a modern Zelda boss, as you use the dungeon item Hammer to destroy its mask, then attack its weak spot to defeat it, one of the more memorable bosses in my opinion. Blind the Thief is a boss that can get chaotic very quickly. Once his head gets knocked off, there's projectiles going everywhere. I just spammed attacks through this one and hoped for the best. Argus is a pretty straightforward boss, hookshot and damage the pieces protecting it and eventually take down the boss itself. Mothula and its boss room look more intimidating than it actually is. The fire rod absolutely decimates this boss, so just spam that fire and you can pretty much ignore everything else and win. Vitrios I found best to just stay to the side of the room and the small eyeballs came to me. Eventually, when it's just Vitrios after you, I just timed the sword slash and boom, it was dead. Cold Stare is one of the lamer bosses in my opinion. Unfreeze it with the fire rod and you have 3 cloud monsters to deal with. You can keep using the fire rod or sword to defeat it as they move around the room, and chunks of ice will fall from the ceiling trying to hit you. Trinex is a boss almost more about magic power management than anything else. You need both the fire and ice rod to defeat it. You destroy the ice head with the fire rod and vice versa for the other head. Just make sure not to overly spam magic at either of the heads and softlock yourself into a death. One of the cooler fights in the game though, for sure. Lastly, we have Ganon, certainly one of the most epic fights of this game. Ganon will teleport around the room throwing his trident around and it's up to you to hit him over and over. Eventually he will start spawning a ring of fire around him that will turn into fire bats that will chase you down. As things near the end, the perimeter floor will crumble away and the lights will go out. You must light the 2 torches to reveal Ganon and quickly slash him with the Master Sword to stun him and then hit him with the silver arrows. Repeating this 1 or 2 more times will conclude the final boss of the game. Bosses and enemies get a 2 out of 5. The standard enemies range from mostly good to very annoying. I think the biggest disappointment comes from the bosses. With such expert design for the dungeons themselves, most bosses end up being just mostly okay or a letdown. I won't deny that fights like Aghanim, Trinex, and Ganon are truly great, but the rest of the cast leaves a lot to be desired. A Link to the Past set the groundwork for future Zelda games to build with not only its general formula, but with side content as well. The game brought more elaborate mini-games like the arrow shooting game and digging game. Most importantly, it introduced heart pieces, which have become a staple for Zelda side content ever since. Particularly in the old Zelda games, heart pieces are more rewarding due to the game's difficulty, so it can really feel worth your time to explore all parts of the map to acquire as many as you can. Because I was getting my butt kicked so much, I made sure to get every heart piece in the game to make my experience a little bit less daunting. Side content gets a 3 out of 5. While many Zelda games would take this game's side content foundation and build upon it in a way we would have never imagined, the simplicity and fun of A Link to the Past side content holds up just fine. There's plenty of interesting puzzles to solve to acquire many heart pieces the game has. There's also several optional items to get and a copious amount of weapon upgrades. Five out of 5 right out of the gate. I don't even need to preface this one. A Link to the Past has a masterful soundtrack that holds up incredibly well. While certainly a fully orchestrated rendition of the soundtrack might sound better, there is still something charming about the original SNES version of these tracks. A Link to the Past brought us so many important pieces of music that have been staples ever since. The Dark World theme, Zelda's Lullaby, Ganondorf's theme, Kakariko Village, Hyrule Castle's theme, probably the most memorable version of the Zelda overworld theme to date. A Link to the Past, in my opinion, will always remain as one of the greatest video game soundtracks of all time. The pacing and progression of A Link to the Past is essentially flawless. So coming in hot with another 5 out of 5 score. The game moves along nicely and never really bogs itself down with an annoying quest or some overly dialogue-heavy sequence. The escape sequence at the start teaches you everything you need to know while still feeling like this epic adventure. Truly one of the best openings ever. Then that leads into 3 well-made introductory dungeons. Once you hit the turning point after revisiting Hyrule Castle and entering the Dark World, the game really starts to open up. After the Dark Palace, you have multiple options for what to do next, which helps not only pacing, but replayability. I can't think of a single instance where the pacing has a flaw. It delivers the right amount of action and moves you dungeon to dungeon while also delivering the story in nice concise bits along the way. A Link to the Past is an incredibly well-crafted game that has standed the test of time better than almost any game. While it's not my personal favorite Zelda, I will always respect everything it has done for the series. So we've gone through every category, and here is the recap of each of the scores. The score averaged out to a 4.2 out of 5, now our highest rated game. We've covered Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, the original Legend of Zelda, Phantom Hourglass, Oracle of Seasons, and the Wind Waker in previous videos, so here is where we stand with all of the games. As we rate each game, we will continue to populate this list and slowly build the Ultimate Zelda series ranking. Make sure to let me know in the comments how you would rank A Link to the Past. Now let's take a look at the next Zelda game we will be reviewing. Thank you for watching.
Open your eyes.